Have you ever camped in the woods in the dirt? Did you hike with a stride that made your feet and knees hurt? Yet all you really wanted was to sit around the fire, but you can't build one now because of Smokey the Bayard. Give yourself a wine pour and join us online for the Least Haunted Campfire Club. It's the Least Haunted Campfire Club, so plug in your ears and cork up your gizzard and shut your eyes like the pinball wizard. It's the summer of 2022 and we got scary stories for you from a small coastal range in the mountains of California.
Hello, and welcome to the final meeting of the 2022 Least Haunted Campfire Club. We apologize for it being a little late, but here it is now, and we hope you enjoy these two new stories. Here is the second chapter of the story, Kerry Creek. If you didn't listen last time, to bring you up to speed, we have an unnamed narrator who has traveled to an empty house in the High Sierra country to set to order the estate of their previously unknown great uncle. And some weird shit happens. All right, here we go. Kerry Creek, Chapter 2. Just on the edge of sleep, the white noise of the swaying leaves and branches above me, mixed with the ever-bubbling of Kerry Creek, helped to lull me further into a state of exhausted darkness. When suddenly my eyes snapped open. Had I really heard that? My mind raced and I fearfully held my breath, straining my ears to assure myself that there was nothing there. Nothing but the leaves in the water could be heard. But then I heard the sound that had jolted me from the edge of slumber once more. It sounded like whispers. Or people having a hushed conversation, the sort of muffled and not quite intelligible words that you might hear in a crowd. Although I could not make out the words or their meaning, I swore I could make out the distinct vocal sounds of at least 3 or 4 people. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the phenomenon ended. Nothing but the sound of running water and branches stirred by a gentle breeze. After several minutes, my heart rate had slowed once again, and my breathing had evened out. I concluded that I must have imagined it in my exhausted state, and as I already explained, my city dwellers' ears were not accustomed to the quiet roar of nature. I yawned long and deep as once again I teetered on the edge of sleep. I heard what sounded like a woman giggling outside my tent. I froze. My previous state of terror immediately returned to seize my mind and body. The sound had come from the side of my tent that faced the running water of Kerry Creek, which meant that if indeed a woman was outside of my tent late at night, then that would require her to be standing in the middle of the creek itself. But I heard no splashing of footsteps in the water, just the ever-present sound of running water confined by muddy banks. I waited for the unseen woman to make another sound, which did not happen. Instead, the same sounds of muffled voices that I had heard before returned. I'm not sure what compelled me to do so, but I ever so slowly pulled down the zipper on my sleeping bag. Each zipper tooth was as loud as a gunshot to my strained and frightened ears. I held my breath. If there was someone outside of the tent, I did not want them to know that I was aware of them. At some point, as I was still drawing down the zipper, I realized that my eyes had adjusted to the near darkness of the tent. That even though there were no city lights, the starlight and possibly a bit of a sliver moon somewhere in the sky gave enough light that I could easily see across the tent to the closed nylon flap of a door. I eased myself slowly out of the sleeping bag and crawled on my hands and knees so slowly across the floor of the tent that it felt like it took me at least 10 minutes to cover the few feet between me and the closed flap. Once in front of the flap, which opened out onto the shore of Kerry Creek, I rose up to my knees. I reached one hand out to quietly grasp the zipper while my other hand readied my flashlight. The voices continued. Taking a deep breath, I pulled down the zipper to open the flap as I simultaneously thumbed on the flashlight and pointed it at the creek. Nothing. No mysterious woman in the water, no group of crouched and hushed conspirators, just the clear water of Kerry Creek. I slowly climbed out of the tent and nervously scanned the surrounding area with the beam of my flashlight. I looked back at the creek and just watched the running water for a moment. Suddenly, a stray waterlogged willow branch floated into the wide circle of light that I had cast on the water's surface. It was chewed to a point at one end, no doubt a refugee from some beaver dam far upstream. I followed the branch with the light as it came just about even with my tent. Then the current submerged it in a little eddy out in the middle of the creek. One end must have got snagged on an unseen rock under the water, because the other end was forced up into the air above the surface. As it did, it caused a small splash of water, and in a curious effect of acoustics and physics, the gurgle of water around the stick momentarily made the sound of a giggling woman. The effect was fleeting, as the branch seemed to free itself and continued on its course down the creek, and I lost sight of it with my flashlight as it swiftly passed around a westward bend in the creek. So that solved that mystery. I had been hearing strange peculiarities in the currents that tricked me into thinking I had been hearing voices. That was when I remembered that I had heard of the pareidolia effect on an internet video sometime before. With that figured out, I decided that I really could get some sleep, and turned to go back into my tent. But before I did, I shot the flashlight beam over the top of the domed tent and back at the old house. I'm not sure why I did it, but I scanned the dark and empty windows with my flashlight. All I could see was the paper pressed up against the glass panes. I lit up the window on the right side of the second floor, and there for a moment in the flashlight's beam, I saw the shape of a person. I blinked, and the image disappeared. All that could be seen was the same masses of paper that blocked the other upstairs windows. Damn pareidolia again. Concluding that I really needed some sleep, I went back into the tent, lay down, and closed my eyes until morning. Morning came like an explosion. I know it is cliché to depict the dawn as some sort of gentle thing that slowly and gradually announces itself, but that is not how things happen on Kerry Creek. I'm not sure how much sleep I actually got after the strange occurrence of the night before, but I was rudely awakened by a cacophony of shrieking birds before the sun had even crested the eastern hills that hemmed in the Great Sierra Valley. Years of practice at squeezing every drop of sleep before my alarm clock would go off had trained me to sleep through most any sound that the city could shout outside my window, but it had never prepared me for magpies. I lay there staring up at the ceiling of the tent. I tried in vain to fool myself into believing that I could probably ignore the shrill cawing of the magpies and possibly get some more sleep before the sun rose properly. But then two things happened that shattered that belief. First, a cow gave out a sound that sounded nothing like the gentle moo of children's books and more like some sort of severely constipated and distressed 800-pound behemoth. It voiced its distress somewhere closely on the other side of the creek. Secondly, I became aware of a painful pressure in my bladder. Sighing in defeat, I unzipped my sleeping bag, threw on my robe, and crawled out the front flap of the tent. I was greeted by the sight of the clear, cold water of Kerry Creek. A shadow moved quickly along the bottom. I wondered if it was a trout, and then wondered if my late great-uncle might have had a fishing pole hoarded somewhere in amongst the mountains of moldering paper in the house. I made my way into the house and quickly made my way to the bathroom to do what had to be done. On my way, I avoided looking up to the landing at the top of the stairs. I kept my eyes glued to the old scuffed wooden floor. Internally, I chastised myself for such a childish thing. Why should I be scared of what was upstairs? I already knew that the shape I had seen when leaving the house last night was only a pile of books and boxes. Same with the shape in the window after that. Was I really entertaining the idea of ghosts? Ridiculous. After taking care of business, I decided that I should make an early start of sorting out the house. I chose to start with the kitchen. It made sense that although I could as easily start anywhere, having a clean kitchen in which to cook in would be a necessity almost equal to that of a bathroom. Also, as I mentioned before, it was probably one of the least cluttered rooms, or it had the least amount of books and papers. Instead, it had piles of dirty dishes, and an almost comical amount of empty boxes of toaster waffles and empty cans of sardines. I say almost comical. If I stopped too long to consider the implications of the life of a recluse who ate nothing but toaster waffles and sardines, it made me kind of sad. I broke down the boxes and stacked them on the porch, at which point I realized that I was in need of basic cleaning supplies, garbage bags, disinfectant, etc. Also, I would need to get some basic provisions to stock the kitchen after it was cleaned, and maybe I should inquire with the locals about garbage service. After all, if I was going to clear out the house, I couldn't just dump everything outside in the yard. So, locking the house, I got into my car and drove towards the general store and gas station in town. While driving down the dirt road, I saw the side road that branched off to the Pioneer Cemetery up on the hill. I figured, what the hell, might as well check it out now. If I do it on my way back, I will have groceries in the car. I made the left-hand turn towards the cemetery. I drove over a cattle grate painted bright yellow, and my car's tires made several staccato thuds as I passed over. The dirt road swung out through a flat cow pasture before climbing up a short hill that stuck out of the floor of the valley. It was crowned by ponderosa pines and a small sea of marble stones and spires. The road ended in an empty dirt lot, and I parked my car close to the gated entrance to the cemetery. The cemetery was surrounded by a 4-foot-tall chain-link fence. There was a turnstile-type gate, with another cattle grate under that. It seemed that the townsfolk did not want cattle to get in. If a bull in a china shop could cause quite a bit of damage, what could a herd of cattle do in a marble orchard? The sun was still low in the sky, and the early morning chill still gripped the valley as I made my way through the gate and started my exploration. It seemed that the cemetery had not only served the town since the time of the gold rush, but that people were still being buried there. I saw a stone with the year of 1865 on it, right next to one from just last year. I wandered amongst the markers and towering ponderosas. The air smelled like turpentine and butterscotch. Somewhere unseen, the magpies continued their god-awful cawing and screaming. I studied the names on the stones, looking for a Kerry. I could see the creek through the trees, cutting through the valley, just to the north and at the bottom of the hill. Was that waterway's namesake somewhere here amongst these stones? Ranging dates chiseled in the marble told the history of the town. In a few places, wooden boards marked the graves of those who could not afford to have their names last for eternity. Years of freezing winter and dry summers had done to the boards as they had done to the steps on the house. Dates and marking eaten by time. These were the graves of nameless dead. And yet mixed in amongst the, at the time, fashionable marble pillars and Romanesque columns, and the blank wooden boards, were modern headstones. Laser-etched portraits of the deceased stared out from the stone, in some cases granite, ensuring that Grandma was now as immortal as the ancient pharaohs. Yet, no Kerrys were to be found. Could it be that one of the nameless wooden boards belonged to the person I was looking for? The soul whose name the creek now held? I probably wouldn't find my answer here. I would most likely need to ask one of the locals after I ingratiated myself to them down at the general store and gas station. As I walked back to my car and made my way through the cold metal turnstile, a tiny thought that had been tickling my brain as I walked through the cemetery became an intolerable itch. It demanded my attention, and I stopped midway through the gate as it finally resolved itself into a full thought. The sign at the entrance to town claimed that it had been founded in 1850, and yet, amongst all of the stones and markers, I had not seen a date older than 1860, 10 years after the town had begun. Was there another cemetery somewhere in the town? Where had they buried everyone for those first 10 years? Within 5 minutes, I was pulling into the parking lot of Sierra Valley Gas and Grocery, a small wooden batten board building with a single gas pump out front. Next to the parking lot was a petting zoo with various farm animals. According to the painted name boards on the fence, the animals all shared their names with classic cartoon characters. I thought about the morose humor in the fact that all these barnyard animals had names painted on wooden boards, while at the top of a nearby hill were many nameless bodies beneath blank planks of wood. There was also a repurposed gumball machine that would dispense handfuls of alfalfa pellets for a quarter. My stomach growled and I made my way inside. A small brass bell jingled on the door as I entered. It was smaller on the inside. Several low double-sided shelves surrounded a central teller's kiosk. The shelves were stocked with the typical gas station fare: chips, candies, bags of dried nuts and jerky. Along the back wall was a refrigerated selection of soft drinks and beer. The wooden floor creaked as I entered. It was worn smooth from who knows how many years' worth of footfalls. The clerk, an older woman in glasses, a Western-style button-up shirt with a gray and white perm, greeted me. "Good morning," I answered back politely. Off to the left, the main room opened up into a smaller room with household essentials and canned goods. This smaller room was a modern addition. I could tell because the floor was linoleum, not wood. Likewise, the walls were white plastered drywall as opposed to the brown-stained pine wood walls of the rest of the store. I looked around and found a small hand basket by the entrance and spent around 10 minutes filling it with various canned goods, snacks, and cleaning supplies. I held off on the things that might require refrigeration because it occurred to me that I had never actually opened the ancient avocado-colored refrigerator back at the house, and as such, I had no idea if it was even working. As the older woman began ringing up my purchases, she began to make friendly small talk. "Passing through?" she asked. "No," I replied. "I'm actually staying a while." "Really?" She sounded surprised. I guess no one really ever stayed in the town. It was usually just a pit stop for tourists headed from nowhere to nowhere else. "Where are you staying? At the hotel?" "I'm not at the hotel," I said. "Good." She leaned over the counter conspiratorially. "Between you and me, those folks that run the hotel are a little weird. I've heard things." I was amused and intrigued. "Really?" I asked. "What kind of things?" I was expecting some sort of sinister rumor of disappearing people, or late-night screams, or maybe more mundanely that it was a secret brothel. Instead, I was surprised when the woman said, "They make folks wear diapers and act like babies." "What?" I asked incredulously. "Babies?" She nodded. "That's what I heard from Mabel, and she heard it from old Joe Stronson's boy, Greg. He went there to dog some work on a busted electrical panel. He's the local electrician, see?" "Oh," I thought, "it's one of those types of towns. This might be interesting." Suddenly, she looked as if she had just realized that I was in fact a stranger and not her neighbor's nephew's kid from down the street. "Where'd you say you were staying again?" she asked suspiciously. I realized that I had to choose my words carefully. Otherwise, the next person who stopped for gas would be regaled about the weirdo who was just in here before you. "I didn't actually say," I answered. "I'm staying at my great-uncle's place. Well, actually, it used to be his place, but now I guess it's mine. Anyway, it's up Willow Road." "Oh!" Her face lightened up with excitement. "You're staying up at Old Goldteeth's." "Old Goldteeth?" "Well, that's what I called him anyways. Truth told, I never did know his name, but he had these 2 gold front teeth, so that's what I called him. 'Good morning, Goldteeth,' I'd say to him when he would come in. 'Good morning, Martha,' he'd say back, even though that's not my name. He said it was only fair that he could make up a name for me if I was going to make up one for him. A real shame what became of him." "Oh, so you knew him well?" I asked. "Oh, no, dear. Didn't know him at all. Hardly anyone did. He kept to himself, except for doing odd jobs around. It was the strangest thing." "What was?" I prodded. "Well, most folks stay around here for 30 years. They get to know everyone. But old Goldteeth never did. So naturally, people would get to talking." I feigned shock. "No, never." For a second, the friendliness dropped from her face, but was quickly back to its previous beaming smile. "Hey," she said, "Goldteeth's nephew is a comedian. I'ma call you Benny. Like Jack Benny? You know Jack Benny?" I told her I did not. "No matter, Benny," she said. "That'll be $45.63. After I paid and she had slid 2 large paper bags filled with my goods across the counter, I asked, was there anyone who knew him? In all honesty, I never even knew he existed until a lawyer contacted me about his house, so I'm just trying to figure out who he was. "Well, like I said, he kept to himself. But if I were you, I'd swing by the History Museum down the street. It's the building that says school on it. Can't miss it. He used to go in there a lot. Maybe Al, that's the guy who runs it. Maybe Al can tell you something." I collected my bags. "Well, thanks, Martha. I'm sure you'll be seeing more of me." Martha laughed. "Bye, Betty." I pulled up to the museum that was in a small, blocky plaster building that said school on it, but I quickly saw a closed sign hanging in the glass front door. I would have to try again some other time. A few short minutes later, and I was pulling back up to the house. I parked on the back side by the back door to the kitchen. It wasn't even late morning, so I still had a whole day's worth of cleaning that I could pack in. I walked up the creaky wooden steps to the door. I looked at the reflection in the big kitchen window next to the door. The glass was old and warbled, an effect erroneously cited by many as proof that glass always remains in a somewhat liquid state. In truth, it's much more complicated than that, but usually warped glass just spoke to the inadequacies in older glass-making technologies. In any respect, the reflection in the window was warped and distorted. I could see my car behind me, and the green of the alfalfa field juxtaposed against the bright blue sky, and where the two met, the darker green smudge of the willows along Kerry Creek. And in the reflection, next to the just visible red-orange bump of my tent, was something white. I looked at the reflection, and the white thing resolved into the distorted shape of a figure, possibly in a white flowing dress that was billowing in a non-existent breeze. The hair stood up on the back of my neck. I stood there looking at the reflection, questioning what I was really seeing. Suddenly, it raised up a very distinctly human arm. I dropped my bags and spun around. There was nothing there next to my tent. No figure in a white gown. Just the wall of willow trees and my red-orange tent. For some reason, I found my feet moving as I ran towards the tent and creek. If there was someone over there, I was going to catch them. Sprinting at a high altitude, such as the more than 5,000 feet above sea level of the Great Sierra Valley, is not a great idea for someone from a sea-level city such as myself. By the time I crossed the short distance between the house and the creek, I was almost completely winded. Gasping for air, I spun around, scanning my surroundings for any sign or flash of white. There was absolutely nothing. Just various shades of green vegetation in the babbling water of Kerry Creek. There was a rustling from inside the tent. Once again, my blood ran cold. There was someone in the tent. I slowly crept around to the creek side of the tent where the entrance was. The rustling happened again. Something was indeed inside my tent. As I got closer, I saw that the corner of the flap was unzipped, and it swayed slightly as the rustling continued. I gulped, in a manner that from the outside observer would have been cliched and comical, but for me, in the moment, it was a sign of me trying to swallow my fear and get my ragged breathing under control. Slowly, I reached out with my hand for the tent flap, preparing to rip it open and confront whoever was trespassing. I lunged forward and gripped the corner of the flap and pulled it open in one motion. Something white and gray flew at my face, and I tumbled backwards into the cold water of Kerry Creek. Sputtering, I looked up in a panic, just in time to see a rather large bird of some sort fly out of the now open tent and up into the sky. All of my fear instantly transformed into laughter. I howled and began to roll in the creek, laughing at my own stupidity and fear. It had been a bird. I must have failed to zip up the tent completely, and a bird had gotten in. That was all it had been. My laughter settled into a mild chortling as I rolled onto my hands and knees and pushed myself up to climb out of the creek. Only a bird, I chuckled again. As I leaned into the tent to grab some dry clothes, something large splashed in the water behind me. I jumped up and turned around quickly to find once again nothing. There was nothing behind me. It occurred to me that although it had been a bird in my tent that had startled me, it had not been a bird that I had seen in the window reflection. I shuddered, half out of chill from the snow-melt creek water dripping from my body, and half out of quiet, tingling fear. What the hell was going on with Kerry Creek? To be continued at some further date.
Psycho pumped about contract negotiations. Psychopomp. Psychopomp. Noun. 1. A conductor of souls to the afterworld. 2. An ostentatious display of military pageantry. Psychopumped. Psychopumped. Adjective. 1. To be unduly enthusiastic about contract negotiations. 2. To know enough about serial killer statistics so as to be a concern to friends and family. Chapter 1. The Last Senator to Die. The very last senator to die was Mr. Edmund Borage, the junior senator from East Montana. To be precise, he was the last senator to die and to stay dead. He suffered a heart attack during the crescendo of a stunningly unremarkable vitriolic improvisational soliloquy on the Senate floor. For those of you who haven't been, the Senate floor is about the size and shape of a college lecture hall, but the seating isn't very steep. There's a lot of blue velvet and nice desks that no one uses, and people to open the doors for you. I will place you there now. You stand where the camera stands on its tripod 4 feet in front of this man who's about to die. The face, as it rants, is puffy and fatty around the convulsing, greasy jawline. The shape of the temples and the eye sockets and the minor details of the topography of his skull are clearly visible from this distance. He's sick with indignation and passion. When Edmund Borage spoke, his lips moved much more than his jaw, even as he yelled. This mouth incongruity was reminiscent of the mighty sunfish, now extinct thanks in part to Borage himself and his party's defunding of the EPA. He sweated into his eyebrows, which grew in the humid microclimate like boreal ferns, blackened with the soot of what he had to say. The sweat broke right through the oversaturated brows and into his eyes. There was a lot of fungus growing all over him, even though he was still mostly alive. Having just last week arrived at middle age, Senator Edmund Borage was far too young to look so ravaged by time. Professional irritation was a butcher to his face, to those dry lips, and to those always on the verge of tearing up eyes, now stinging from salt.
The anti-work, anti-God, child trafficking trans mob is raping the American worker. Raping him! It may yet be too late.
Indeed, his inner child had been trafficked away and replaced by the changeling child of religion and prescription drugs and Twitter. Borage peed a little bit into a jerry-rigged external bladder he had duct-taped to his inner thigh. Already full, the urine leaked around the rim of the condom, nearly overwhelming its grip on the congressman's miniature member. He privately referred to his dick as a member of his own Congress of Two. One of his balls had been auctioned off during a secret fundraiser. He held up a pair of shears.
I'm like you, workers. I say that we either take back our right to work from the federal coddlers or we castrate ourselves and submit to the abhorrent whims and perverted predilections of the communist fascist state.
He mimed castration with the shears.
You want to know the fastest way to become a traitor to your fellow workers? Join the Lentil Union.
Lentils, dried and shelled, made $93 million in 2031, or 21.1% of East Montana's total exports, and they had financed his re-election campaign each cycle since his Senate seat had been created. He now stood swaying, lightheaded, but resolved to stick the thing out.
I cannot in good conscience allow myself to succumb. I will defend the lentils of East Montana and their cultivators even unto my final breath.
Had anyone been interested enough to consider this last bit of biblically inspired poetry, one might have concluded that Senator Borage seemed to be under the impression that he was filibustering in order to prevent the Union from doing something or other. As it was, no vote was on the docket. Borage made as if he was looking around at his colleagues impressively. No other senators were present. He was playing for the camera, and for history, and for his followers. This would appear in his next ad campaign. As he had instructed, the camera was zoomed in enough to hide the empty Senate floor behind him. An establishing shot of the Senate in full attendance could be manufactured in post. He summoned up Atticus Finch and repeated,
"Unto my final breath."
This last utterance drew a series of enthusiastic buzzes from Ed's third watch, which he had strapped to his right thigh. This watch measured likes. The second watch, on the other thigh, had been keeping a steadily increasing tick indicating engagement. His first watch, the one on his wrist, tapped too. It provided a heartbeat pulse set to modulate with the pulse of his viewers, averaged out. The viewers who happened to be wearing a watch and had downloaded the Freedom app and accepted the terms and conditions anyway, which was most of them. His taps were encouragement. They kept him focused. He could already feel the small donations rolling in, nickels and dimes in the tens of thousands. He just had to keep up the momentum he built. He wished he had some water. Just before he lost consciousness, swaying, he thought of his mother and her anger and rage and her ruthlessness and how proud she would have been to see him now, all alone, but commanding an army. The taps represented a white-hot ball of fury that could be aimed anywhere. Today it was unions. His heart pumped, paused, ruptured, and then stopped beating altogether. Tomorrow it would be pronouns. He gasped. His taps crescendoed. As his body toppled forward onto the podium, the pen in his pocket, unluckily positioned so as to skewer his two remaining members of the Congress of his pants, did so, and he tilted sideways, rolling forward. His feet didn't move in this tree fall. His body crunched down, twitching onto the velvet blue carpet. Hearing the tumbling noise, one of the aides looked up. The stenographer stopped typing. Senator Borge was already hundreds of miles away and far underground. His second testicle was back again. The kaleidoscope of toxins in his head had gone. He breathed and breathed. For the first time since childhood, he felt honest happiness without caveat. What had he been saying? He hardly remembered. Who was he? Well, he was a mind. That much was certain. He sat on the shore and played with the wet sand of oblivion. Chapter 2. The Fairy Woman. The river Styx isn't a literal river. It's a river in the same way that money is a river, or that power is a river. It flows like a river. It makes literal changes to the world. It is impassable without the right kind of vehicle. The fairy woman had the right kind of vehicle, but it was limping. After tens of thousands of years of use, and after the increasingly larger and more frequent loads of mines in the last 100 years, it took on water. Use had rendered the little boat's seaworthiness dubious on a good day and preposterous today. It carried about as much water as it didn't. It was half sunk, but still it floated on. The fairy woman, who wasn't a literal person but was probably metaphorical herself, had patched the hull with bubble gum and embalming fluids and human skin and duct tape in so many places that it was more a patchwork of found material representing a hull than the original wood. She had a bucket used to scoop and poured the symbolic water out of her metaphorical boat whilst she analogously rowed through the allegorical river. She rowed with her feet. Her arms held the bucket, scooping and pouring in a steady rhythm. Slish, sploop, sploosh, swash, etc. The fresh mind, not at all a metaphor, but a bit less than material, sat on the beach. The thought of looking around and exploring had not yet occurred to it. The mind looked vaguely like its body had looked in life. Not so hairy, and not distinctly any age, but the likeness was, with some imagination and squinting, that of Senator Edmund Borage. He still wore a suit. He had had a bad batch of bad blood circulating around and around for so long that, bit by bit, he had stopped noticing that he felt sick all the time. This quease had been the background drone of his life. The toxic chemicals of decades of anger and bitterness and violent thought dreams leave their mark on the body and the character of a person, but not on the self. It should be noted that definitions are not very much help here. Soul, mind, spirit, essence, life force, self, identity, they all mean the same thing or different aspects of the same thing. In this story, we can just throw all those out. It won't be fruitful to define and redefine terms. Edmund was there now, at the shore of his afterlife, and, fundamentally, he hadn't brought his bags with him. He was a child, and any responsibility for his deeds was rotting upstairs with his corpse in a casket draped in Old Glory and her 54 stars. Edmund, who would have taken a while to recognize his own name, was a kid once more, and he was finally beginning to get bored waiting. He was so bored that he began to wonder what he was waiting for. He looked around his landscape. This was ostensibly underground, since the doorway to the afterlife could reasonably be expected to exist in some cavern deeper than we've ever been. Every human intuitively reckons that buried bodies keep sinking as they boost up the local flora. We all know this deep down. To float to heaven like a balloon would take helium and wishful thinking. But this didn't look like a cavern. It looked like a gray shore on a white, foggy day, without a lot of visibility, but with a bright, bright sun illuminating everything from somewhere up there. There were no shadows. There was no foliage either, even up the slope away from the river. Instead, there were the roots of dozens of different trees sticking out and reaching into the air as if there was something nutritious they could pick up on the gusts of sea breeze from the water. Had a functioning nose existed in this purgatory, it would have smelled rot. Mines, similar to the late Edmund, lay all about the shore, spaced every 50 feet or so, wiggling their toes in the sand and casually surveying the same scene. Most were animals, so in many cases the hooves wiggled in the sand with oddly human dexterity. No one was surprised at their sudden materialization on the shore. All except for Ed. He was beginning to suspect something was up. Two weeks later, the ferrywoman arrived, her skeletal ship and skeletal self appearing out of the blinding white fog of the river, or lake, or maybe it was a sea, all of a sudden. The mind had just about worked out who it had been. It had figured out enough to say by way of greeting, "Good morning, my dear. I wonder if you could give me the Wi-Fi password." The skeleton rowing the boat and pouring out the water paused in her work. She let the boat coast into the sand, slightly sinking and finally coming to rest just in front of Edmund. She had no response to this. The last time someone had addressed her, it was to request her to sing "Come Sail Away." Even with her mastery of all languages, modern idioms were always a puzzle. She'd been doing this for long enough to know the proper response.
"There's no Wi-Fi here."
The mind stayed quiet, and the ferrywoman's face, which was no more than a human skull, betrayed no irritation. Formal introductions were in order. Chapter 3. Controlling the Means of Propulsion. She actually did have a little more than just a skull. She had invented an ingeniously designed and beautifully arranged device for speaking. The device was comprised of a concertina squeeze box, and rubber bands, and bungee cords, and a whoopee cushion, all fastened with paper clips and duct tape to various parts of her neck bones and ribs. By flexing certain bones in her neck and angling her head and jaw, she could approximate human speech.
"There's no Wi-Fi here, but there might be across the shore."
She wheezed at the mind. The mind peered out into the white fog. "I don't have my cell phone anyway." Oddly, he felt naked in front of this skeleton. Now, more aware of his body, he found he did have 3 smartwatches strapped to his appendages. They had no signal. All these trappings somehow felt cumbersome, and he looked again at the patiently waiting skeleton. The things he was wearing felt indecent. He quickly worked the watches off, and the rest of his suit, and his bottle of cold piss. He stood naked in front of the skeleton in the little rowboat, feeling quite a bit better about himself. Taking his skin off would be the next thing, but that felt like a lot of trouble. He wondered if he should try this before boarding.
"Ready to go?"
she asked kindly. He was relieved that losing his skin didn't seem expected. Looking around briefly, he decided that he was ready. The skeleton casually stepped out of the boat. She pulled it up onto the sand and held it steady as the mind clumsily made his way in. As he situated himself, she perused his pockets and the watches, tossing a few items of interest into a small backpack that was tied to the boat's railing. Gracefully stepping back into the boat with one foot, she shoved hard against the beach with her other foot, and they launched into the fog, rocking and creaking. Wordlessly, the ferrywoman demonstrated the use of the bucket, which the mind found delightful. He dutifully took up his position in the front of the boat, scooping out water from the hull while she rowed. To make chit-chat, she asked,
"So, what brings you to our fair river?"
I think I seem to remember giving a speech and losing my breath."
"Oh, and don't worry about the fare. Those watches were more than enough. Can you believe that we work on tips?"
Tips only? Why, that's disgraceful. All the mind was aware of about the nature of the universe was the shore, the roots, the other dead animals, and now the boat, and this kind skeleton, and the white on white of the river in the glaring fog. His natural inclinations as a politician, and more fundamentally as a person who has to be liked by everyone, led him to take the side of whomever he was speaking to at the time. As he continued to bucket the water out of the floor and overboard, he slowly began to piece together opinions concerning ethics. It certainly wasn't right that she should rely on tips. "You're not salaried or anything?" She shook her skull. "Healthcare?" She attempted to raise an eyebrow. It didn't work. "No, I suppose not." The mind fell silent, thinking. The injustice brought about memories, far and away, as if reliving someone else's life. "I was so angry all the time before now. I think I must have lived some past life where it was all anger and misery. I think it felt so important to stay mad. How strange."
It's not that uncommon. People leave much of themselves behind. The selves they made on the surface. They leave all that with their corpse. It's not uncommon to feel a little disconnected here.
"I was a senator. I was in America." He squinted at nothing in particular, then looked around momentarily, stopping his bucket work, wondering for the first time, "Where am I?"
I'm taking you to the other side, and I rely on tips.
"Oh, yes. That is truly unjust. It's odd. I was delivering a speech against unionizing back up on Earth."
What's unionizing?
New ideas came to the ferrywoman seldom. Most of her patrons said little, preferring to play with their hands in the water or simply sit on their backs and stretch and wiggle and sigh. This guy was with it, and not too bad with the bucket either. "Are there other..."
Psychopomps?
Huh?
Psychopomps.
Is that slang?
It's Greek or maybe Roman. I can't remember now. Someone explained the origin of the term to me hundreds of years ago, I think.
Huh. Sounds modern, like some kind of music genre.
It may be that too.
So, are there a lot of psychic pumps?
Plenty. I'm not sure how many, but there are regulars I see along the river from time to time.
My alive self must be rolling over in his grave, but I'm going to suggest this anyway. He paused dramatically as if giving a speech and looked deeply into her eye sockets. "You should unionize." Ed's mind explained to the ferrywoman how unions function and how bosses might bust these unions. He knew the inherent weaknesses of union organization, having exploited them for decades on the Earth's surface. The river was wide. They spoke for hours. It got very theoretical. She dropped him off on the far side of the river and the gates of eternity. This was again a sandy shore, but instead of roots, iridescent mushroom mycelia and long abandoned webs of solar system-sized cosmic spiders crisscrossed the landscape and skyscape. Here, the stars all looked like strings of light as they orbited the galaxy. You could watch time. The true black of space behind all these strings of light made Ed's eyes, which were predisposed to be watery all the time, to dry up. He blinked as he took on infinity.
This is where I leave you.
Please don't.
My job is to shepherd you. I must leave you here.
You mean the job where you don't even get paid? What if you didn't?
I must.
But why? Who is your boss? Is God up there somewhere? She lowered her head. It was hard to say what emotion she meant to convey. So little can be gleaned from a skeleton's body language.
I'll stay a little longer. Perhaps you could show me how these work.
She rummaged through her backpack and stepped out of the boat to meet him on shore, holding out his 3 smartwatches. They spent the rest of the afternoon playing with the watches, finding that not only did they not lose power in this realm, but the Wi-Fi was excellent. The ferrywoman had invented this promise just to get him on the boat. It seemed that nothing could die here, including gadgets. Edmund was generous. He delighted that he could be of such use. It's no small thing to put a smile on the face of a skull. When she finally did leave him that evening, she was a bit heartbroken. After all her time working at this job, she had made her first friend. She made up her mind right then and there as she watched him climbing one of the mycelial tendrils. She made up her mind as he branched out into dozens and hundreds of himself and shifted in color and form. She made up her mind as he became new concepts and new flavors and new experiences for the living. As Edmund spread out, she made up her mind that she would go on strike. She decided that before she did that, she would form a union and encourage others to strike. It wouldn't be hard. She sat on the shore with some papers and a pen that she had taken from a Croatian lawyer in 1997. She wrote up a manifesto. Now she just had to get the gang together. No one would die again until her demands were met. She was psycho pumped about contract negotiations. So that's the story. It's pretty much a self-contained short story, but I think I might keep going with it. I have some more ideas. So hope you enjoyed it. And that does it for the Campfire Club for 2022. Sorry this episode came a few days late, but it took a while to finish up our stories. We'll be actually, you know what? I'm just going to hand it over to him. I think he has some finishing words here.
Thank you, Garth, for kicking that back over. We hope you have enjoyed tonight's meeting with these two stories that, as you might have guessed, are probably going to continue. Kerry Creek has got a lot more to go, left out on a cliffhanger there, and maybe later this fall, the entire story, once it's finished, will be presented in a special bonus episode of the Campfire Club. In the meantime, enjoy listening to our regular Least Haunted releases. We got a lot of stuff that is in the works, so if you can't wait until next summer for the Campfire Club, don't worry, there will be other things on offer. We thank you for joining us and making this a lot of fun. We've enjoyed doing this. This was year 3, our 3rd summer of the Campfire Club, and it was a lot of fun. And we just want to keep doing this. So until next time, stay spooky out there. All right.
It was the least haunted Campfire Club. It was the least haunted Campfire Club. Oh, it's the least haunted Campfire Club. Audio show.
The Least Haunted podcast is recorded before a dead studio audience and is a presentation of Sequoia Productions, LLC.